Hey everybody, welcome back. So today we're talking about a pretty emotional topic for some people, and that is live feeding our snakes. You see a lot of people in the discussions get really vehement about it on both sides of the discussion, and I think some of it may have to do with the fact that people that have been live feeding for years, you genuinely think they're doing the right thing. It may feel like they're being come down on by the people on the other side of the discussion. People on the other side of the discussion, have serious concerns about the animal's welfare and so forth. And a lot of opinions get tossed back and forth in that. Well, we always share opinions, but when push comes to shove, what do? We take our animals to the vet. If you see something, you see your snake has an injury, looks like it may have a disease process going on, some kind of illness, we'll get opinions on that. But ultimately, what ends up happening is we take our animals to the vet. We take our animals to a doctor who has studied these animals and can determine exactly what's wrong with them and how to fix it. Okay, so it seems to me like the live feeding issue should be addressed the same way. There's a difference between subjective and objective. Subjective is opinions. Subjective is, I think this is okay. Okay, that's an opinion. Objective is the part of that opinion. It's what we base our opinions on. Objective facts are what we should base our opinions on. It shouldn't be an emotional discussion. It should be a basic discussion of right and wrong. Look at the facts, look at the implications, and then make our decision based off of that. So that's what we're talking about today on Intrepid Exotics. Whether you're a lifelong keeper or just getting started, help us encourage responsible keeping, conservation, and public education in the interest of keeping our reptiles safe and healthy as we protect them for future generations. You're invited to spend time with us as we experience these awesome animals together on Intrepid Exotics. So it's always good, right up front, to establish what the goals of the discussion are. This particular discussion, I've come up with 4 goals that we're hoping to accomplish by the end of this. The first goal is to establish a baseline that we're going to use to measure our decisions off of. This can go into a really deep philosophical conversation. It won't here, but to me, it's a basic issue of right and wrong. And people will have different definitions of right and wrong. My definition of it is where you fall on the scale of doing the least or the most amount of harm. Typically, generally, a good rule of thumb is the thing that does the least amount of harm is the most right action. Okay? I think that's a fair baseline that a lot of people will agree with, and I think that's a good place to start. The next thing that we need to talk about are what the health implications are for the animals, what the benefits and problems are between feeding live and feeding frozen. Okay, it's a major consideration. The next part is the risk assessment. What are the risks associated with feeding live prey as opposed to feeding frozen? And the final goal at the end of it is to determine what the best feeding practices are based on the evidence. Not what we've been doing, not what we want to do, not what we enjoy most, not what's most convenient for us. Based on the evidence, based on what the facts say about how we're feeding and how we're taking care of and what risks we expose our animals to. Tom Crutchfield is somebody who's famous. His memes are all over the place. It's not what's in the best interest of the keeper, it's what's in the best interest of the kept. There's a lot of merit to that, and particularly in this discussion. And we walk a fine line as reptile keepers because there's a precarious balance that we've got because, most of us have just got a deep love for these animals and a deep respect for nature. The other side of that is the animals that we keep require whole prey items. And it can be a double-edged sword for people. You love animals, yet you've got to kill them in order to feed the animals that you've got. So it puts a gray area in there with a lot of people, I think. So let me put up a quick analogy here to, kind of put this whole conversation into perspective. Let's say, for instance, you get a mole, something, a blemish on your skin. You show it to your uncle. He says, don't worry about it. I've got those things. They've been there for years. Well, you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you it's skin cancer. A reasonable person is going to follow what that doctor says and not go back to his uncle and say, well, the doctor says it's skin cancer. He says it's bad for me. And then listen to the uncle when he says, man, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Like I said, I've had this thing for years. It hasn't went anywhere. Now, part of establishing the goals of this conversation is kind of ranking our concerns in order of priority. And as far as the care of the animals go, I think there's another 4 ways that we can kind of rank these considerations when we're talking about live feeding. One is ensuring the humane and ethical treatment of all living creatures, every animal involved. That should be our first priority. We should make efforts to be as humane, as ethical, as empathetic as we can and do the least amount of harm. I think everybody can probably get on board with that. The next consideration after that, if it meets that guideline, we look at the physical safety of the snake because we don't want to intentionally harm it. We go down from there, we're talking about the health of the snake. If we're treating the animals ethically and we're not physically putting the snake in danger, let's look at what the health implications are of what we may be doing. And the absolute very last thing, after we've ensured we're being ethical and humane, after we've ensured that we're not putting our snake in danger, and we've ensured that we're doing what's best for the snake from a health perspective, then, and only then, does the convenience of the keeper come into play. Okay? And I've heard some different arguments on this too that I'm going to go into here in a bit that are just ludicrous. But that's why we're doing this video. Now, as we're looking at all of these things, I've made a point of getting specific references, and those references are obtained from zoological facilities, doctors of veterinary medicine, and universities. Okay, and you're going to find all kinds of stuff online. You're going to find everything from YouTubers to pet stores, to people who sell cat food, dog food, whatever. You're going to find opinions on all of those things. I find anytime I have a question, the best thing to do is to do this. And I'll show you how I look for things. And maybe this will help some folks out too. We've got this wealth of information here on the internet. Let's go to do a search here. Feeding snakes live over frozen thawed. Okay, pretty common thing. I'm sure most reptile keepers have done this. Okay, now as I scroll down here, this doesn't mean anything to me. This is a pet food guide. This is the first thing that you see on Google. Whether or not you agree with this position, look at the source. It's a pet food guide. Okay, we go down a little bit more. Rodent Pro. These guys sell frozen rodents. Of course, there's a bias there. We don't look at that. This, I don't know what that is. Wiki, okay. A lot of different opinions in there. Pet food guide, I don't see anything. More Rodent Pro, dun-dun-dun-dun. And Quora, this is just a bunch of opinions. Reddit's the same thing. So we got to go to the next page. PetMed. This is going to be a little bit more reliable. I see MedMD or PetMD in here. I'm going to click on it. And I'm just going to glance at the article and see if I can find any kind of a citation. I don't see who wrote this. Okay, it could be anybody. So I have no desire to go through and base anything on that. So we're going to keep looking. So clipping this thing out right here with a typical question. I've went through 7 screens so far, and I haven't seen what I'm looking for. So, and you can see how which search engine you use too has a direct impact on what you're able to find. I went through 7 pages of Bing looking for that. Now we get on just regular Google, get down the first page here a little bit, and let's see, we've still got the Rodent Pro stuff on there. We still got some other pet stuff on there. So after a few minutes of looking, I see vetmedillinois.edu, the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Illinois. And the very first thing that you see is exactly what we're talking about as far as the risks to feeding live. Now, I certainly don't want to demean the value of experience. There's a lot of people out there that have been doing things for decades, but the problem with that is that if you base your opinions on research, that research is continually updated. Scientists are continually testing and retesting and studying and updating studies and trying to duplicate studies. And that's something that the person who has been doing the same thing for 20 years doesn't do. He says it's okay. He's done it this long. A lot of times, and you hear this a lot, I've been doing this stuff forever. It's perfectly fine. Go ahead. I just was talking with an acquaintance the other day who had went off and gotten his first retic, the very first feeding attempt, the second day that he had it. He threw in a live feeder and the snake got injured because that person told him, it's okay, that's what I've always done. Okay, what could he have done to mitigate that? So when I've got a question about something, this is what I look for. When I'm looking for information on something, especially animal snake related, I go to universities, veterinarians, I go to the science. And this is where a lot of my supporting information on this comes from. This particular site, University of Illinois, College of Veterinary Medicine, your pet snake's diet, dead or alive. This is a question that we're talking about, and what's the very first thing that comes up? An incident with a boa, looks like a red-tailed boa there, that was attacked by its prey item. I've referenced this. I'm going to have links to all of these things down in the description so folks can read them all for themselves. But just to quote this veterinarian here, Dr. Christina Keller, a veterinarian at University of Illinois Veterinary Teaching Hospital in Urbana who specializes in zoological medicine, strongly advises snake owners to feed their pets a pre-killed diet and warns of risks associated with feeding live prey. Notice how this is worded. This is worded that they advise that. Okay. I know some people can be very sensitive to feel like they're having things dictated to them and so forth, and this is how you must do it. That being said, it's always in our best interests to give a lot heavier consideration to people who spend literally years of their life sitting in a classroom and working with the animals and studying this. That's how society progresses. We lean on the efforts of those that come before us. Nobody knows everything. So we've got to make best decisions based on people who are specialists in their field. This case is no different. I'm going to show you another example right here. And I know a lot of people that are on this channel, I hope everybody that's on this channel, is a U.S. ARC supporter. So here's the U.S. ARC page. And this particular article that they posted, they forwarded off, was written by Hobbs at the College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences, Texas A&M University. Snakes should never be fed live prey. It is cruel to the prey animal and can also be dangerous to the snake, she said. The prey animal, if not killed quickly, can bite the snake. In some cases where the snake is not warm enough or sick, the prey animal may even extensively chew on the snake. They make the point right here of the animal not being killed quickly. And I want to show this other chart that I had found. This particular one is at ResearchGate. It was posted on a Journal of Exotic Pet Medicine. There's 2 authors to this. I don't see anything on Johnny Cooper. I see David Williams here is from the University of Cambridge. And there's some other quotes on here. This is another good thing to read. But for everybody who is under the impression that as soon as you put that live animal in there, that snake just gets a hold of it and kills it, I want to show you this chart. This particular table says the time of death is estimated by cessation of movement with different predators and prey. Time of death of live mice was 62 plus or minus 29 seconds. Live rats, 54. So essentially what this thing does is they did a study with several different species of snakes and several different types of prey items, and determined how long it took for them to actually kill that prey item. If we're looking at ball python, the average was 40 seconds from the time that snake initiated the attack until that animal was dead. Milk snake and a mouse, 72 seconds. The longest one here, corn snake and 2 mice. Not sure why they did another ball python and a mouse. California king snakes. Indigo snake, 42 seconds to kill. Boa constrictor on a rat. Now, boa constrictors are strong animals. They're not, we talk about the ball pythons and the corn snakes and things like that. Well, they've got smaller prey, but when you start talking about boa constrictors, now you're talking about full-size breeder rats. And if you've ever been bitten by a rat before, if you've ever been scratched by one, kicked by one, you understand how dangerous these things can be to something smaller like a boa constrictor. And if you're looking at a time frame of, what did this thing say? This one was a boa constrictor, and a rat. Took 82 seconds for that thing to die. Okay, that's that's almost a minute and a half for this snake or for this rat to be in there fighting. How many of you guys have fed your animals and you see the snake completely miss it, doesn't get it by the head, doesn't wrap it up, you might get it by a leg or something. You're feeding a rabbit, you might grab it by the ear. Once that feeding response kicks in, they go for it. They don't always sharpshoot their targets and so forth. I mean, the risk, like say for instance, the worst case scenario for me would be I feed 8-pound rabbits to my male reticulated python. And when he's really hungry and he's got a hot food response, he may strike the tongs, he may strike the wall, he may strike the door, he may get that rabbit by one leg. And that rabbit has time with that one leg in that snake's mouth to do one good kick, and it can kill the snake. 8-pound rabbits have got really healthy claws on them, and it's nothing for that thing to rake across, take an eyeball out. That thing could penetrate its skull. It could, tissue damage and so forth. It could get an infection out of it. There's example after example of this stuff happening, and for people to ignore it under the presumption that this is the way things have been done forever and I'm not worried about it, it just kind of boggles my mind a little bit. This is a serious consideration. How many of you guys would pick up an 8-pound wild rabbit, pick it up by the scruff of the neck, and hold it up against your nose? Why would you not do that? I'm assuming you wouldn't do that. Why would you not do that? Because you're afraid it's going to bite you. You're afraid it's going to sink its teeth into your nose and pull a chunk of flesh off. You're afraid it's going to kick you in the neck. I mean, we've got to exercise a little bit of common sense when we're trying to figure out what the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do is. So objectively, based on what we've looked at just already, without going any further than this, without going into any more of the pros and cons, when we talk about, our first consideration is that the humane and ethical treatment of all the animals involved. I would say it is more humane, it is more ethical for the prey item to be instantly killed and not thrown into an enclosure where it's having to deal with, upwards of a minute and a half of sheer agony, at the hands of a predator. That stuff happens in the wild all the time. But let me ask you this. How many of you guys that have dogs understand the fact that our domesticated dogs come from wild animals, come from wild dogs? Okay. There are dogs in the wild. Those dogs in the wild hunt and kill their prey. Now, I want to know how many of you guys that live feed your snakes also live feed your dogs, and why you don't do that. I'm assuming you don't do that. If you do, there's a lot deeper conversation that needs to be had. So if we look at it honestly, we should be able to stop right here with the understanding that torturing a prey item is less humane and less ethical than instantly euthanizing it or peacefully euthanizing it. But for the sake of the conversation, let's go one step further. And we're going to talk about the physical safety of the captive snake. Now, this is another thing. And breeders will run into this on a regular basis, There are situations that put our snakes at risk. Breeding is one of them. It's not uncommon. It happens, a lot more frequently than anybody would like it to. You throw a smaller male in with a bigger female, and that bigger female just decides she wants to get teeth on him. I've seen some really nasty injuries on snakes because of that situation. So, in order to breeding, you've got to have them together. But when we're talking about feeding, when there is an alternative to putting a live animal in there that can injure your animal, that alternative seems to be the most humane, the most ethical step to take. You hear quite frequently about how snakes are apex predators and they're hunters in the wild and they hunt down their live prey. Well, just because something is an apex predator doesn't mean that their experience hunting and finding food to survive is pleasant. Let's look at a couple examples here. Okay. Many would consider bears apex predators who suffer injuries while they're hunting for food. Great white sharks, also apex predators. And look at the injury that this animal sustained. Lions, king of the jungle, top of the food chain in their environment. Lost an eye, has an infection. It may end up killing this animal. Tigers, same thing. Prey item injured this animal, and it's one of the most dangerous animals on the planet. So we got to ask ourselves, is this something that we would be happy to see in a zoo setting? Say, for instance, you go to an aquarium where they've got great white sharks, which they can't because they don't survive in captivity well. But say, for instance, they're there. And would you condone putting them in a live feeding situation where you throw another dangerous prey item in the water with them and let them fight to see who's going to win? Same thing with the tiger. How many times do you go to a zoo and you see tigers that have gaping wounds on them from prey that's kicked them or slashed at their eyes or bit at them and things like that? These are all powerful apex predators, and this is what they deal with in the wild. In no other case would we find this acceptable than what you hear some snake keepers talking about with throwing live prey items in with their animals. Now, I'm not going to go completely overboard with all the pictures. There's literally hundreds of them online that you can find. But let's look at this real quick. This is a ball python. Somebody put a live feeder in there with this animal. It didn't want to eat at that particular moment, and the rat commenced going to town on this animal. Now, I know one argument that's going to be posed is, I control the live prey when I'm feeding. I'm there with them. I watch them the whole time. There's no way I would ever let a prey item, just chew on my animal like that. There's no way I'd do that. Well, that's understood, and as well you shouldn't. But let me ask you this. How long do you think it would take for this injury to happen? If you look at it, this looks like top and bottom teeth of a rodent. That's one bite. Okay. How long do you think it took that bite to occur? What was it, 80 some seconds on average that the prey item was still alive from the time that the boa in that table had taken the prey item until the time that the prey item actually died? How many of those injuries do you think a rat, as it's fighting for its life, can inflict on your snake in a minute and a half? Okay. So, from the perspective of the physical safety of your snake, the conversation, again, should stop there. If there is a viable alternative to live feeding your animals, to putting a live animal into that cage with that animal, that other viable alternative should be your first choice. So if we ignore the ethical treatment of the prey, and we ignore the physical risks to the snake from throwing a live prey item in there, and go one step further here, and we talk about the health of the captive snake. Now, to make this really brief and simple, freezing is not a guarantee that you're not going to get parasites, you're not going to get bacterial infections, things like that. But freezing does mitigate it to some degree, because freezing does kill a pretty big percentage of organisms that are going to be in that animal. It also breaks down the cells. When cells freeze, they'll lyse a lot of times, they'll burst. It's a lot easier for a snake to digest a frozen thawed prey item than a live one in many cases. On the other side of that coin too, you'll see a lot of people that raise their own rats, that do live feeding and so forth. If their rat colony's healthy, if they keep it up, it's an entirely different discussion than if you were to go out. I think everybody pretty much agrees that you just don't set out rat traps, bring those rats inside and feed them to your animals. But the fact remains that if you take that captive bred rat and you freeze it to a certain temperature for a certain duration, you're going to kill a lot of those parasites and bacteria and so forth that otherwise would have been alive when your snake consumed it. So if you look at it on a scale of good to bad, from a health perspective, it leans to the safer side feeding frozen than it does feeding live. Okay. Now, after we've looked at, are we treating the animals ethically? Are we looking after the physical safety of the snake? Are we looking after the health of the snake? Now we fall into the convenience of the keeper. What's more convenient for you? Now I've heard some interesting logic surrounding this, and people saying that it's just so much more convenient for me to go pick up a live animal and throw it in there, or it's inconvenient if you've got hundreds of animals to go and thaw out all these animals and so forth. I mean, if we're talking about a matter of convenience, then how inconvenient is it to raise a rat colony? How, the expense of feeding, housing, the space that they take up, the steps that you have to take to keep them clean, keep them free of disease. I don't understand that argument. I'm sure if somebody's only got a couple animals, it may not be a big deal. They can go to the pet store, they buy a live animal. Even still, it's more costly to purchase a live animal in many cases than it is to find a breeder and get frozen thawed feeders. It all almost seems like, after going over the first three things, a moot point, convenience of the keeper, it almost seems ridiculous to even talk about. But there's another aspect where that convenience of the keeper over the needs of the kept kind of comes into play. And that is something that you hear so often when people talk about live feeding, and that is, my animal refuses to eat any kind of frozen thawed. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that there's not instances where that happens. Okay. I've fed live before to hatchling snakes with fuzzy rat pups and things like that don't have developed teeth, that can't injure the animal, in an attempt to entice them to eat when I'm having some difficulty getting them to eat on frozen thawed food. But there's, just because a snake refuses a frozen thawed meal, the very first conclusion that you draw should not be, my snake doesn't eat frozen thawed. You've got to look at all of the reasons why an animal may refuse to eat. Okay. Now, we can go over some of them really quick. Let's say, for instance, you've got a new snake. Say it's a 1-year-old, 2-year-old retic, something like that, and you offer it a frozen thawed meal. You hold it up there for 30 seconds. It doesn't take it. You pull it out. You say, okay, this snake's not going to strike at this particular thing because it's frozen. Now, did you take into account what kind of stress that animal may be under? Because an animal under stress a lot of times will not eat. If they're not comfortable in their environment, If they're still not socialized and comfortable around you, then they may refuse to eat. Also, if their environment's not right, you know, snakes metabolize their food by regulating their body temperature, and if they're not being able to warm themselves enough, they may instinctively not eat. But that's not the case with all of them. It's still possible to really have bad feeding experiences if you don't have the proper heat for your animal and they ingest a meal and then they can't metabolize it right. But neither here nor there. Their environment is another reason why they may not eat. Some snakes will refuse meals if they're in shed. It's a pretty obvious one that a lot of people pick up on. Snakes will refuse or accept meals sometimes around their breeding cycles. Almost all the time. That's a big part of what breeders will use, as far as determining when to put the males in and things like that, and when they're ready. And snakes also have natural fasting periods. I've got 2 snakes in my collection, a ball python and a reticulated python, that have both went off food for 5 months. Okay, snakes, particularly large constrictors, are fully capable of going extended periods of time without eating. Now, you have to be concerned and pay attention to their weight, look for any signs of disease processes, things like that. As long as they look healthy, they're not giving any indications that they're malnourished. All you can do is offer them food. Sooner or later, just like in my case with mine, they took it. It wasn't a consideration for me when I offer a snake a meal and he refuses it. Damn, he just went off frozen thawed. A couple weeks later, I'd offer again. A couple weeks later, I offer again. When that snake's ready to eat, it'll eat. And it puts another thing into perspective there too, that you'll see with a lot of these, that if your snake's refusing a frozen thawed, there's a good possibility that it just doesn't want to eat, that it has no interest in food at that moment. And although some snakes will instinctively go after something that's moving, if they already don't want to eat and you put a live prey item in there with them, they may have no interest in it, which means they may not address that animal at all, which is how a lot of these snakes will get chewed on. They're not hungry. They don't want it. And for some reason, they just allow that animal to chew on them like that. I don't understand it. It's something to look into, but it is something that happens, which is really sad to see. And another reason why an animal may not want to eat is they may be sick. They may have some kind of a disease process that you can't see any signs of. And, they may also have an injury of some sort that you're not aware of, that they may be refusing food for. So these are all things to take into consideration before we automatically assume that we're offering our snake a meal, they're refusing to eat it, therefore automatically the snake doesn't eat frozen thawed. Okay. To do that, it's being a lazy keeper, and it's not taking the proper steps to take everything into consideration when you're looking at your snake's behavior. Okay. You could be overlooking something either in the husbandry or in the health of the snake because you're stuck on the idea that it's not going to eat frozen thawed prey. The number of snakes that I've seen that have never taken frozen thawed, so minuscule. I mean, I can think of one retic of the hundreds that I've interacted with that had a note up there, feed live. So statistically, if your snake's not eating frozen thawed, the problem is one of those things, or you're just not going about introducing them to that prey item right. You're not putting enough effort into it, whatever the case may be. I know people don't want to hear that. It's real easy to just say, this is the way it is, this is the way I'm going to do it. That's not always the case. Okay? So we've all got to exercise a little bit of humility. It's not always about just standing our ground and fighting for our opinion. Okay? If we're going about this in a scientific manner, from an educated perspective. All of those things are fluid. Opinions change based on new information. And if you maintain a method or an opinion contrary to new information, then you're doing yourself and you're doing your animals a disservice. I'm not entirely sure how many nicer ways to say that. And one thing too that you see sometimes is that people say that they don't have the stomach to kill the animal before they put it in there. If they've got a live animal, it's just easier for them to throw that live rat into the enclosure, that live rabbit, whatever it is, into the enclosure alive and let the snake do the dirty work. Well, of course it's easier. But, how are you going to feel that one time? Say, for instance, you're feeding a live rabbit to your snake. You've got that rabbit in your hand. It's live. It's kicking around. You throw it into the enclosure. The snake gets a hold of one leg. The other leg kicks its eye out. How quickly are you going to be able to get in there, intervene to stop that? You're not going to be able to. When the alternative to having to experience that situation right there is to really quickly, humanely euthanize that rabbit and put it in there. Almost everybody that you talk to that is really, really dead set against live feeding is that way because they've experienced something like that, where they put an animal, a live animal, in with an animal that they keep as a pet that they care about, and that animal was injured because of it. That's the hard lesson that a lot of people learn. So, I'm not going to sit here and say that you're evil if you're live feeding. I'm not going to sit here and say that there's not times when it has to happen. But I think all the evidence points towards the conclusion that live feeding is not the preferred technique. It should be avoided at all costs and should only be implemented in order to keep that animal from starving to death. And if you have an animal that's resistant on getting on frozen-thawed, then you need to put some real effort into learning why that animal's not taking it, because it may not just be that animal is doesn't like frozen-thawed food. There could be any number of things that are going on with that snake. And you've got to rule all of those things out first before you start putting your animal at risk. Okay? Smaller snakes, it can be a little bit less serious. The prey items are smaller. They've got less developed teeth, smaller claws, things of that nature. They're a lot more fragile. So it's a different discussion with something smaller like that. But the discussion still needs to be had. And when you're talking about larger snakes, it should really be a no-brainer. By the time, say for instance, a reticulated python, by the time a retic is 2 years old, you've had 2 years to get that animal on frozen-thawed meals. Okay? By the time a retic gets 2 years old, you're feeding them large rats, small rabbits, things like that. By the time, that snake starts moving up 5, 6, 7 years old, now you're talking about meals that are going to be ranging from like 5 to 10 pounds. Okay? And you do not want to be throwing a live 10-pound rabbit in with your snake. Yeah, your 16-foot snake is big and mean and strong, and you may really enjoy watching it kill something. But sooner or later, statistically speaking, something bad's going to happen eventually. Why risk it? And on the humane and ethical treatment of animals, it is extremely important in the reptile community right now to police the behavior of people in our community. There's a lot of laws on the books in a lot of different states, and a lot of the decisions are going to be made based on the public perception of people who aren't reptile keepers. What we do matters. What we show people matters. So if you're one of those people who's on YouTube or TikTok or whatever, and you've got the title and thumbnail of live feeding my snake, live feeding my monitor lizard, just so that you can make a couple bucks off of letting people see an animal get tortured and ripped to pieces publicly. Just understand that you're toxic to the reptile community, and you need to stop. Period. Everybody thinks that this is a whole National Geographic thing, and that's what they do in the wild. Well, you're not showing a wild animal in a struggle in the wild. You're showing the fact that you're playing gladiator with a captive bred animal in a situation where you're putting both of them through unnecessary suffering. It's not funny. It's not cute. And if you need money that bad, get a second job. Okay. It just puts the whole reptile community in such a bad light. So the whole point of this is really simple. It's not here to pick on anybody. It's not personal. Unless you're doing the live feeding videos that I just talked about, then it's pretty personal. And I think you just really need to remove yourself from the community. If you're comparing live feeding to feeding pre-killed or frozen thawed meals to a snake, going by those 4 constraints that we had talked about, feeding frozen thawed or humanely euthanized pre-killed is more ethical and it's more humane. Objectively speaking, it's objectively safer for the snake because there's no way a dead animal is going to attack it. It's objectively healthier for the snake because there's less chance. Less doesn't mean zero for the argumentative people out there. There's less chance of a parasite and bacterial load. And as far as convenience of the keeper goes, that need not be an excuse for overlooking any of the other 3 things that we talked about. Like I said, we put what's best for the animal over what's best for us. And if we can't do that, we either need to find help taking care of animals if we've got too many of them, or we need to reduce the number of animals that we've got, or maybe you need to start collecting plushies instead of living, breathing animals. And I'll make this disclaimer right now because anytime there's an emotional topic hit on, things like that, you get trolls, you get people that are, I welcome comments, I welcome other points of view, I welcome other facts. We already know that there's different opinions out there, and I've made it clear this is a factual discussion and not a personal discussion. So anybody that jumps down the comments with this, you're picking on me, you're talking down to us, or anything like that, that's not the point. I'm just going to remove that because this isn't the Jerry Springer show. Okay, we're looking out for the best interests of our animals and the keepers and the community as a whole. So let's keep it a positive, factual discussion, and start taking steps to make sure that we're not unnecessarily doing things to put our animals at risk. That's what this is all about, guys. And especially now, states are making laws upon laws, and the people making these laws think that reptile keepers, in some cases, are just evil, and they love to see animals suffer, and the animals are so dangerous. Any number of excuses. And whatever our personal feelings are about things, we have an obligation to the rest of the community to do our best, to do the right thing, to do it as humanely as possible, and put ourselves and other keepers in the best light we can. So please take all of that stuff into consideration, guys, and we will see you next time on Intrepid Exotics.